Of all the questions that we wish we had a recorded answer from Jesus, I suspect fairly low down on that list is the one that the Sadducees asked of, whose wife will this widow be who married all the brothers? Take yourself just a moment to think, if you had the opportunity right now to ask Jesus just a single question, which one is it that you would want the answer to? If any of you are feeling particularly brave, you can tell me what your one question would be. Any offers for one question for Jesus? Why are there diseases? That seems like a very good one to me, and one that many of us would share. Any other offerings? Well, I thought I would gather together the collected wisdom of the internet on this one. And of course, somebody has started up a thread of what would you ask Jesus. And these were some of the top questions there. Joel Benjamin, he went for a rather meta answer. He went for, Jesus, what advice do you have for me? That's a bit of a cop-out, isn't it? That's like when you ask at the end of interviews, they say, do you have any questions for us interviewers? And you say, yeah, what would you say that I should ask? You know, it's one of those cheeky answers. Dennis Oakley, he went with, do you mind if I record this? Which seemed like a sensible one to me too. Ian Davidson, what's the big wait for the second coming? I can see many of us wanting an answer to that one. And Ernie Bornheimer came up with my favourite, which is, would you like one of these cucumber sandwiches? Which is the sort of thing that has that charming ring that I can imagine exactly happening when you feel completely bereft of words and you say simply the first thing that pops into your head. The Sadducees' question seems to us to be a fairly irrelevant one. And from the text, we can assume that actually it was fairly irrelevant to Luke's readership as well. At the beginning, he has to explain who the Sadducees are. He says, some Sadducees, those who say there is no resurrection, came to him and asked, and so he goes on. The fact that he needs to explain that the Sadducees are the ones that don't believe in the resurrection suggests that they probably weren't terribly important or even well known to the people who were listening to Luke's gospel. The Sadducees largely fell off the scene as being important after the destruction of the temple. Their main job was to be the kind of temple priests, the one who looked after that building. And that building was destroyed in about the year 70. And so when it was destroyed, their reason for existing kind of came to an end. And they were overtaken by the Pharisees, the other group that we hear about, who were a much larger and stronger sect. Luke doesn't include this story about the Sadducees because the question itself is particularly important or relevant. He doesn't include it because the Sadducees are very important or relevant. So what's the big deal? Why do we find this in his gospel? Well, it comes to us at the end of a chapter where Jesus' rhetorical skills, his skills of argumentation, his quick wit, have been demonstrated throughout. We're in chapter 20 here, so we're towards the end of Jesus' ministry. We're in Jerusalem. We've gone through all of the stories that happen in his itinerant preaching and miracle-working career, and we're here in Jerusalem for the final confrontation. And he, in this chapter, is in the temple engaging with the people there. And it begins with the chief priests and the scribes and the elders coming to Jesus, this chapter, and saying, by what authority do you do these things? By what authority do you teach? By what authority do you do these miraculous deeds? Who is it that gave you this authority? It's a question that they're setting to try and catch him out. And he answers them and says, okay, I'll tell you if you tell me something first. He says to them, you know John, who baptized. Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of human origin? That's his question he sets back to them. And they go off into their little huddle and they chat with each other. And they say, we know that if we say it came from heaven, he'll say to us, well, why didn't you believe it? And if we say it came from earth, all the people will be really cross with us because they love John. They think he's a prophet. So they come back to Jesus and they say, we don't know. And he says, well, I ain't going to tell you either then. And they're made to look foolish. So foolish, in fact, that they realize it's not a good idea for them to come back and question him again. So they employ some spies. And they get these spies. They're not very good spies because they kind of go up openly. I guess it means sort of people working vicariously on someone else's behalf. They employ these spies to go up to Jesus and to say, Teacher, we know that you are right in what you say and teach, that you show deference to no one but teach the way of God in accordance with truth. You know that when you hear a bit of flattery like that the next thing that's coming is going to be no good. And they go on to say to him, is it lawful for us to pay taxes to the emperor or not? And Jesus does answer them directly this time, sort of. He says, bring me the coin that you pay your taxes with. They bring it to him, and he says, whose face is this? They say, it's Caesar's. He says, render unto Caesar that is Caesar's, and unto God the things of God's. And they walk away, unable to come up with any answer to him. And finally, we hear the story from today, where the Sadducees try to score some points. They're asking about what heaven is going to be like. But the issue for them, and they get in their answer back, is that they just haven't got sufficient imagination. There's a lovely book, one of my favourites, by Julian Barnes, called The History of the World in 10.5 chapters. And in the first chapter, it starts off with the Ark. You don't know it's the Ark, and sort of spoilers here, sorry for the first chapter, but the story's not very good without it. You start off finding out all about the Ark, and only towards the end of the chapter do you realise that the perspective you've been hearing all of this about is from one of the woodworms in the woodwork that makes up the Ark. And you go through kind of catching up with different bits and pieces of history, and then the final chapter is about heaven. And in that final chapter, it's a sort of dreamlike state, and we're following the protagonist who's died, and he's there with his kind of angelic, heavenly personal assistant who follows him around and does whatever he wants. And he says to this assistant, what kind of heaven is this? And she says, they get the sort of heaven, the people who come here, that they want, the sort of heaven that they think that they want. And so he asks her, and what sort of heaven do they think they want? Well, she replies, they basically want a continuation of life. That's what we find, but better, needless to say. And what that turns out to be is principally golf, going round the course in 18 shots, shopping, and meeting famous people. And surprise, surprise, after a couple of millennia of this, the underlying banality of all of that is revealed. And the character that we've been following concludes that this heaven, where everyone gets what they think they want, is a very good idea. He says it's a perfect idea, you could say, but not for us, not given the way that we are. Our imaginations are just too small. And so it is with the Sadducees in the story today. Their imaginations of what heaven is going to be like are just too small. After Jesus responds to them, we read that they say, Teacher, you've spoken well, and they no longer dare to ask him any more questions. What all these stories are demonstrating is that Jesus has no problem defeating his opponents with words. When they ask him questions, they're left silent. When they try to trick him, they find it backfiring. They're amazed at the wisdom which he speaks. Jesus is clearly in control. He has the people on his side, and he can make the greatest debaters of the age seem foolish. We're left in no doubt about his abilities. And so the reason I suggest to you that this story is included is because of the role it plays in setting up the scene for the upcoming finale, Jesus' trial, another verbal battle with the authorities. We're shown these demonstrations of Jesus' power over human adversaries so that we know he should have no problem arguing his way out of the fraudulent charges that are brought against him at his trial. So much greater our shock then when at his trial Jesus remains almost entirely silent. Though he could easily refute the ropey evidence that's brought, he chooses instead to walk the path of the cross, knowingly and despite his ability to avoid it. That Jesus went to the cross for my sake and for yours was not some accident or some mishap. He wasn't finally caught in a situation that he just couldn't wriggle out of. He wasn't overpowered by some great wielder of rhetoric. He went willingly and in his own power to lay down his life for the salvation of mine and of yours. Christ was not coerced or trapped into the cross, but he chose the path of suffering for the sake of my salvation and of yours. Amen.